You might like to turn to the book of Nehemiah, or if it's on your phone, you might want to switch on Nehemiah, or whatever you do. I've never had a Bible on the phone, and I've got the joy of a wobbly doodah this morning, so it's going to make reading my notes even more difficult than it is already. Okay, today is the final part of our sermon series on the book of Nehemiah, which we've been delivering over 6 Sundays this term under the general title of Come, Let Us Rebuild. And as you know, this was exactly the challenge that Nehemiah gave the people of God. We saw that in chapter 2, verse 17. He shares his heart with them and he says, come, let us rebuild. And they respond very positively. And he led them to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, which we discover were broken down and consumed by fire. Now, Nehemiah's name, I told you at the very beginning of this series, actually means the Lord comforts. And that's a very good name to have as you come among people who are a bit distressed. And so it's like even his name is prophetic. So he is coming into a distressed situation. His name, like who he is, because names are very important in the Bible. So his name given by God means the Lord comforts. And he's not just bringing nice words of comfort, he's bringing comfort that sorts everything out. Now, in their time, there was a literal rebuilding. But this theme, as we've said, seems so appropriate for us all today on so many levels as we begin to emerge from the ravages of the last 18 months. And we know the whole world has faced a global pandemic, is still facing it to some extent, and the news in Europe is not good this morning. So we're still dealing with the multiple impacts of it. Much of it very negative, not all of it very negative, but it's been a very life-changing experience, and it's affected the whole world. And so we're rebuilding, whether individually or as a church or as the church across the nations of the world. And so I know, as I think James mentioned a few weeks ago, of so many pastors and churches that are looking at this book right now because it just feels so appropriate. As you know, the quick version of the story is that this is all taking place in the 5th century BC, because what has happened a little bit before the time of Ezra and Nehemiah is that Jerusalem has finally received the judgment of God. It's been sacked by the Babylonians. People have been taken away into exile. Not everybody, some were left, but many, many were taken. And Jeremiah says, you're going to have to get used to this, guys, because it's going to be this way for 70 years. And so he says, don't think this is a quick thing that's going to be fixed by God. You're going to have to ride this one out. So you basically, go to it, and you just have to bear the consequences of what's been going on for many, many centuries. But God will intervene on your behalf. God will never, even in his judgment, abandon you. And that is always true. Even in God's judgment and his adjustment of us, he never, ever abandons us. He's always doing it with a redemptive purpose. So after about 50 years of this exile, a number of people come back, and they come under the leadership of a man called Zerubbabel, and he's been released to go and rebuild the temple. So the stop-start rebuilding of the temple until finally it's finished with the encouragement of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And they're contemporaries, but they're so different. If you read their books, I always smile that Haggai is my kind of guy. He's very practical, gets down to it and just says it. He says, you're saying it's not time to rebuild. It is time to rebuild. Go to it. Stop messing around. Zechariah talks about wheels within wheels and flashing lights and all that kind of stuff. So you take your pick, whichever helps you in doing the will of the Lord. But these guys came alongside the people of God, and they got the temple finished. but the city was not finished. So there was worship going on, but the city was not in good shape. The walls, as I said, were broken down. The gates were consumed by fire. So there was still work to be done. And so after about 60 years, a man called Ezra turns up. He's been given permission to do so by Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And then about 13 years after him, Nehemiah turns up. And different speakers from amongst us have looked at the story from a number of different perspectives. And so my task today is really just to try and bring together the key things that I believe we can learn from what we've been hearing as we pursue our own rebuilding plans. I'm going to focus on us as a church, but feel free to adapt what I'm saying to fit your own front lines. Excuse me. Notice, number one, I'm going to give you, how many have I got here? I think I've got 10 things, but don't worry, I'm going to do them very quickly. Because they're summaries, because it's all on the website, and if you've been here every week, you will have heard much of this. But I'm not simply summarizing what everyone said. I am trying to take some of the key points out of what has come, as I feel they speak into what we're trying to do as a church. Number one, Nehemiah's story begins with a problem. And many stories of triumph begin with a problem. Because stories of triumph are about overcoming, aren't they? And of course, if you've got nothing to overcome, you haven't got a story of triumph, because you've not overcome anything. And so don't be discouraged if we start with a problem. So in this story, the problem was, as I said, the walls of Jerusalem were broken down, the gates were burned, things were not as they should be. When we look around in our own generation, in our world, our spirits are similarly provoked, aren't they? Things are not as they should be. People are not honoring and embracing God as he wants, as his heart aches for them to do. In particular for us, in New Life Church, we saw a whole new population growing here in northwest Cambridge, many people coming from around the world to be part of it, and we had a sense that there needs to be a real light shining here. There needs to be a proclamation of the gospel here. It's not right that all this development has been planned meticulously and nobody has ever thought of God in the doing so. Years ago, when people, even the new towns I'm talking about in recent decades, were envisaged, there was always some idea of a church building, even if it was ecumenical. Bar Hill is like that. These days, it is a sign of the times, folks, that is not a consideration. And it certainly provoked our spirits, didn't it? It wasn't right. Nehemiah was in a very comfortable position. Although he was an exile, he'd worked his way up, and he'd got a fantastic job in some ways, not in others, but he was cupbearer to the king. So he was a foreigner, but here he was in the inner circle of the king's court. He was a very trusted and valued servant. The only snag was, of course, being cupbearer to the king. The whole point was that he was going to taste all the king's food before he did. And so if anyone was trying to bump the king off, it would be Nehemiah who got bumped off instead. So there was a little bit of a catch to the story, but nevertheless, it was a very trusted position, because the king trusted Nehemiah to make sure that everything was being served was right. He was comfortable, but his spirit was provoked. And I know that that's what we've described to you, for Carol and myself. We felt comfortable as part of a well-established group of churches and Christians in the twin villages of Histon and Impington. We were very comfortable, but we felt provoked because there was a greater need elsewhere. And I just love the way that Nehemiah felt compelled by God to leave that comfort zone to pursue the call to Jerusalem. And that is exactly, I think, our story too as a church. So well done, church, because we heard the Spirit's cry and we've responded, a bit like Nehemiah. That's the first parallel I see. Secondly, Nehemiah sought God in prayer. So did we. Nehemiah shared his vision with the people who responded in faith. And we see that in chapter 2, verse 17. He goes to the city and he shares what God's told him to do. And the people respond positively. And they say, yes, let's rebuild as you say. Let's do this. And he says the God of heaven, at the end of chapter 2, is going to give us success. So we will arise, therefore, and build. And that's what we've done. And you know, if you've been around, how that happened. Nehemiah, thirdly, had the favor of some very key people. In chapter 2, verse 5, he waits for the right moment to speak to the king, and then the king notices he's not looking his usual happy self. He's a bit sad, and you're not really supposed to be sad in the presence of the king. So this was a kind of dangerous moment, but also a moment of opportunity. So the king says basically what's going on. And as Tim was saying last week, Nehemiah had an arrow prayer to God, and he said, this is the moment, okay, help me, Lord. And he explains to the king, and the queen is there with him, why he's sad and what he'd like to do. Now, that was a pretty brave thing to do. But you know what? The king responded favorably. He granted him not only permission to go and do this, but he granted letters and gave authorities to all sorts of people under his governance to help Nehemiah do this. And I saw a parallel there with us as well. Right from the very beginning, the link we had with the key people at the council who are working on new developments, the community development team, people like Vicky and Lisa, who'd be very, very supportive of what we were doing. Some of the key staff at Stories Field Centre, the postdoctoral centre. Some of you will know the behind-the-scenes stories I'm referring to where we had favour at key moments. Some of the key staff here at the school. Even the lead manager at Sainsbury's, who was very, very willing for us to sing carols there 2 years ago, and hopefully will be very willing for us to sing carols again in a few weeks' time. And then more recently, as you've seen from my pastor's email, the local ward council, in fact, both local ward councillors, because one of them, who was newly elected, came along to Eddie's Cafe a couple of weeks ago, something like that, had a wonderful time, very, very supportive of what we're doing. And the other ward council I discovered last week has known Tim for years and is very supportive of what we're doing. So you see the parallels when you respond in faith to what you sense God is pressing in your spirit. God works on your behalf and he orchestrates things and they come together. But number 4, equally, it would not be truthful to the story to say that Nehemiah faced opposition from some who did not want this project to go ahead. So right in the beginning, in chapter 2, verse 10, when he's just about to arrive and begin the work, it says here that Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, and it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. What an interesting phrase. And a little bit later on in that chapter, even after the people have responded positively and said they want to do what Nehemiah is suggesting, these same people mocked us, it says in verse 19, and despised us and accused them of rebelling. I'm not going to go into details publicly, but it was interesting, you know, that there was a time, don't worry about that, there was a time when we felt that very real sense that not everyone was completely happy about having a church group in this place. Medieval myth makers comes to mind. And yet, of course, it isn't about being a medieval myth maker. It's about being a light in the darkness. It's about being truth into deception. It's about being love in the midst of hatred and faith in the midst of fear. So Nehemiah surveyed the situation. He went round, in his case, on a donkey and inspected everything, and he came up with a plan. And so did we. Many of us remember the prayer walks. We literally walked around this area. We brainstormed. We talked to the community development team. What were some of the needs? That's how, as you know, Eddie's Community Cafe came about, because there was a real sense from the community development team that would be a blessing, that would help to bring about this sense of community that doesn't come naturally with new developments. And we've just celebrated our 3rd birthday. Despite the challenges of COVID, it only had to pause for a bit, but we tried to make it work somehow all the way through. And now, of course, we're back in full swing. And it's wonderful to hear some of the testimonies just the other day of people who've talked about this being a lifeline to them. Now we come to a very important point 6. Everybody had a part to play. Just have a look at chapter 3 with me. And I'm not going to read it because it's a very long chapter, but there are 2 phrases that come again and again in almost every verse. In chapter 3, verse 2, it talks about, let me just start off. It says at the beginning that they started work, and then who was doing it? And then in chapter 3, verse 2, it says, next to him, the men of Jericho built. And next to them, Zachar, the son of Imri, built. And then next to them in verse 4, and then next to him in verse 5, then next to them in verse 7, and next to him in verse 8, and next to them. And so it goes on and on and on. And then another phrase is after him and after them and after him and after them. And it's just a succession of statements about how every single person had a role to play. And it would be true to say, wouldn't it, if you were talking in ship analogies, that this was a battleship, not a cruise liner. There were no passengers. Every single person had a role to play. Everybody had a section of the wall to build. Everybody had a job to do, and they were kind of shoulder to shoulder. And that's something that Tim was drawing out in one of his sermons, wasn't it? It's about next to, after, next to. They followed one after the other sequentially. They were next to one another. There was this sense not just of people just doing their own thing, and it somehow came to pass by the grace of God, but they were doing it together, understanding why they were doing it in that way. And I just want to pay tribute to everybody who works so hard and has worked so hard, whether they've set up the chairs this morning, whether they're putting the PA together, whether they're rehearsing songs, whether they're preaching the word, whether they're welcoming people, whether they're looking after the children, whether they're putting up leaflets to advertise carol services, whether they're helping at Eddie's. I could go on and on and on and on. And I just believe the Lord wants to say thank you. You think, well, what, the Lord doesn't say thank you. Yes, he does. Yes, he does. Eventually, we want to hear him say, well done, good and faithful servant. And that's a way of saying thank you, isn't it? Thank you that you served me and fulfilled my purposes with all your strength in your time. And I believe the Lord's smiling and he's saying thank you. There was a sense of purpose and mission. And it's hard work and it's not without its challenges, but the goal is worth it all. There's a lovely story I heard recently about 2 stonemasons in medieval times, and they were building together alongside each other on a big project. Someone came up to the first stonemason and he said, "What is it that you're doing?" And the first stonemason said, "Well, I'm putting this stone on top of this stone, and then I'm going to put this stone on top of this stone." He said, "Well, that's good." And then he inquired of the second stonemason, "And what is it that you are doing?" He said, "I'm building a cathedral." to the glory of God. And you see the slight difference in focus? The goal is worth it. So they were all focused on what they had to do, but they did it because they saw the prize of the rebuilding of the walls. Are you just putting a stone on top of another stone, or are you helping to build a cathedral to the glory of God? Of course, in those days, they would often pass on that job to their son, was typically male in those days, son and grandsons, because, as you know, it took decades, sometimes hundreds of years, to build these mighty cathedrals. So they didn't even see the end of the project in their lifetime, but they identified with the fact that it was a cathedral they were involved with. This new development is going to be at least 15 years in the making. At least. Darwin Green, 5 phases, here 3 phases, more extensions being talked about in West Cambridge. I don't know whether I will be alive when all that's finished, but I'm thrilled to play my part, as I know many of you are right now, because I identify with the goal. Now, point 7, their initial success only provoked a fresh wave of more intense opposition. Not what you want to hear, perhaps, but it's what happened. So in chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, "It came about that when Sanballat," we've heard a lot about him, haven't we, "heard that we were rebuilding the wall," it says very clearly, "he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria and said, 'What are these feeble Jews doing?'" It carries on with a few more insults. So he faced opposition before he'd even started. He got going and saw great success, everyone working together, and then the opposition just intensified. I felt a bit like that when I thought of what COVID did. I'm not saying, COVID just affected us. Of course it didn't. But it was jolly hard, wasn't it, in those days to try and keep going because we didn't have our own building. We found it very hard to meet anywhere inside in this area. But we kept going. And Nehemiah's response was exactly the same. He encouraged the people to be full of faith and to resist the enemy tactics. Look at verse 9 of chapter 4. Actually, look at verse 6 before we get to there. So they've got all this mocking. For example, Tobiah saying, "If a fox would walk on your wall, your city wall, it would just fall down because you're so feeble and useless." At times, the enemy can penetrate into our thinking, can't he? And tell us that what we're doing for God is just feeble and useless, and it's all just a pointless waste of time. But I love the way verse 6 just says, "So he built the wall." So he built the wall. So he just got on with it and built the wall. And then in verse 9, it says, "We prayed to God and we set up a guard against them day and night." Now, this is an important point. I just want to pause here a little bit. They prayed to God, they set up a guard, and they carried on working. I don't know whether this is actually true, but a phrase that has been passed down for many years as a tribute to Oliver Cromwell was that Oliver Cromwell, in the time of the English Civil War, back in the 17th century, said, "Trust in God and keep your powder dry." Anyone ever heard that? Of course, in those days, it was gunpowder, and they would have to do flintlock rifles and so on. So if the powder was damp, it just wouldn't work, and they would be defenseless against the enemy. Now, whatever you think of Oliver Cromwell, and I'm not here to give any kind of judgment on him, He certainly was a man who professed to believe in God and was very devout in that. And so he was being quite sincere when he's saying, trust in God. God's going to come through for us. But at the same time, keep your powder dry. And that is a wonderful point to draw from this story. Not the story of Oliver Cromwell necessarily, it's a reference, but what happens right here in verse 9. Because we must keep rebuilding. We must trust in God, but we keep our guard up. Now let's just develop that a little bit as we go into the next few verses. Because then there is this troubling sense that maybe it's not going to work out. And so in Judah it was said in verse 10, the strength of the burden bearers is failing, yet there is much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the walls. Then they start quoting their enemies. They will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work. And when the Jews who lived near them came, so I'm struggling because of my glasses. And when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come against us from every place where we may turn. So you see what's happening? There is a sense of being overwhelmed by the problem. Then they start quoting the enemy's lies, and then they start reporting them repeatedly. When the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they're going to overwhelm us. We can't do this. What is all this telling us? It's telling us that fear can undermine faith. And the closer you get to the voices of fear, the more your faith is undermined. That little phrase in verse 12 is quite instructive. The Jews who lived near them came and told us. Now, I believe they literally lived near them, and I get it. They would have been first to be beaten up in their minds. They were worried. So it was a physical, literal, geographical proximity. But I think there's a spiritual truth in that. That if you allow fear to get close to you, if you start believing the lies of the enemy, then you can find your faith undermined. However, conversely, faith will always overwhelm and crush fear. And it isn't like they're equal forces. When you put your faith in God, then you will crush fear. Look what Nehemiah does. I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the walls, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords, their spears, and bows. All of those things are weapons. They were physical weapons. Paul says the weapons of our warfare, Ephesians chapter 6, and you know what it's the breastplate of righteousness, and so on and so on. And he says, Nehemiah says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And you will recall, many of you, that was one of the 4 verses God gave me when we were fighting the battle of Carol's cancer. And we're so grateful to see complete victory in that, complete healing from that difficult time a few years ago. And that was one of the verses that God gave me. He said, don't be afraid. Remember the Lord who's great, and fight. There's always that combination. Don't be afraid. And that phrase comes over and over and over and over again in the Bible. Why? Because God knows us so well. Fear not, fear not, fear not, fear not, fear not. Because hundreds of times it comes in the Bible. Don't be afraid. Remember God who is great and awesome, and fight. And then look what happens when they do that. Our enemies heard basically that we are taking this stance and that God had frustrated their plan, and so we all returned to the wall, and basically they kind of gave up. And the reality was that despite all their defensive tactics, which worked very well, they still faced intense opposition. In chapter 6, and we're just moving to the climax when sort of everything's all sorted, the enemy tries another set of tactics. And if you read chapter 6, you'll see how they try to lure Nehemiah into a trap. They make up lies about what they're doing, and they try and turn people against them. Nehemiah is completely aware of what's going on and doesn't pay any attention to this. But this pattern is true for faithful believers in every generation. You must not take spiritual opposition as a sign that God's not with you. In fact, it's usually a sign that he is. Now, I'm not preaching a sort of doom and gloom type scenario here, far from it. But the very fact that there is spiritual opposition to what you are doing, whether it's together here in Northwest Cambridge or whether it's on your front line, whatever area you're serving God in, the fact that there's opposition and difficulty does not mean you've missed it. It actually probably means you're absolutely in line with what God wants. And he says, I love this statement from Nehemiah in chapter 6, verse 11. He said, should a man like me flee? And he's not going to flee. And I asked a question, a man like what? Should a man like me? Does he mean an appointed official? Does he mean a royal servant? What does he mean? I think he means a man on a mission. And we can interpret that as a man, a woman, a child, teenager. It doesn't really matter. If you are on a mission with God, you're not going to flee. And the wonderful truth, here we come to the penultimate point, is that God, if God is in the project, it can only succeed. In chapter 6, verse 15, it says, so the wall was completed on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. When all the enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Never, ever give in to those who taunt and mock, because if God's in the project, it will only succeed. Final point for this morning. Remember the story I told you about the stonemason who didn't just think that he was putting one stone upon another, but he thought he was making a contribution to building a wonderful cathedral to the glory of God. That was the ultimate goal. And I want to make this point as I close this morning, because the ultimate goal of Nehemiah and Ezra was not actually about rebuilding the walls. That was not their ultimate goal. It was a means to an end. It was about rebuilding the community of God in that location. And James was talking about that the other week. And the same is true for us. Our ultimate goal is not about having a meeting place, having meetings, doing stuff. Our ultimate goal is the building of a community of people that will reflect the heart of God and share his love and light to those in this area. In their case, as we saw in some of the things James was describing, usury was abolished in chapter 5. Generous hospitality was practiced. Remember how generous Nehemiah was with his table, feeding so many people. God's precepts were read to the people by Ezra. Adjustments were made. Sin was acknowledged. Some people gave very generous gifts for the work of the Lord, and then eventually systematic giving by all was put in place. People then finally renewed their covenant with God and with one another. And I love this word covenant. It's a very powerful biblical word. It's nothing like contract with a get-out clause. It means a deep and abiding commitment. In God's case, it's never broken. And God has made covenant with us. We, sadly, sometimes mess up a bit, and we're not faithful as we should be. That's what we read in the New Testament, isn't it? Is it Paul's letter to the Philippians that he remains faithful, but sometimes we're not? But this covenant, this is a phrase that was so powerful to the Old Testament people. And Ezra was calling them back to the covenant that God had made with them, all the way back in the time of Moses. That's what was being read to them, the first 5 books of the Bible. And that's where I'd like to end today. As we pursue our own calling to the growing communities of this area, let us, in the words attributed to Oliver Cromwell, trust in God, but keep our powder dry. Let us build in faith, and let's establish a covenant community that pleases God and reflects his values for everyone to see. Let's pray. Father, I just love the reality of this story. The sense of distress, a provoked spirit to action, challenges, setbacks, opposition, and yet ultimately great success. And Father, I just feel led by the Spirit right now to pray for brothers and sisters around the world who are battling some tremendous challenges in the different nations of the world where things are horrendous. And Lord, forgive us if we moan and groan inappropriately at times when we think we've got challenges. But I just want to honor them before you, Lord, as they serve you faithfully, as they do the most amazing deeds of faith and acts of faithfulness, Lord. And they're our brothers and they're our sisters. Some are dying as a result of their stand for you in different nations of the world. And we bring them before you today. We don't just think of ourselves, but Lord, I pray in the name of Jesus for your grace upon them, grace upon us all. Help us, Father, not to be fearful, but I trust in the great and awesome God and fight for what we know is true. Amen.